Welcome. This lecture is on World War I. In August 1914, politicians sent a generation to war, one that involved tens of millions on the battlefields. Young men marched off to the cheers of family, teachers, and friends without understanding the vast scale of the conflict. The early recruits looked forward to glory and honor, but many witnessed slaughter, filth, vermin, starvation, and disease. In total, more than 65 million fought in the Great War that involved 32 nations. At the conclusion, there were 9 million dead in battle and 21 million wounded. The technology of weapons resulted in stunningly deadly arms, including poison gas. The Great War marked the point when Europe began losing control over other regions of the world. Beyond Europe, the war and its aftermath spread the concept of self-determination, which many people around the world took as a call for national independence and self-rule. The European economy lost ground to the American economy. As a result of World War I, Europe went from a dominating civilization to a wounded one. The principal nations were the British Empire, France, Italy, Russia, and Serbia against the central powers of Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. The war was mainly due to political decisions that began decades earlier. In the late 19th century, Austrian leaders feared the breakup of their multiracial empire, and German leaders expected that major changes to Austria-Hungary would hurt Germany. The Russians were fearful of German and Austrian expansion that would relegate Russia to a minor power. And this meant assisting Serbia against any Austrian aggression. Apprehensive of increased German power, the French had an alliance with the Russians. The British were also wary of the Germans having too much power. In the past, Britain's sympathy had been more for the Germans than the French. This changed as the British and the French developed closer relations. During the turn of the century period, there was a furious signing of treaties of alliance. This was testament to mounting political and security tensions. The evolution of the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia, locked both sides into a position where it would only take a spark to lead to a much greater confrontation. On June 26, 1914, a 19-year-old terrorist representing Serbian nationalist interests killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the crown prince and heir to the Austrian throne. Ferdinand was a devout Catholic who was passionate about the restoration of historic church buildings. His assassination and that of his wife gave Austrian diplomats an opportunity to pressure Serbia. The Austrians feared Slavic nationalism. Encouraged by Germany, Austria issued the Serbs an ultimatum and then a declaration of war. This provoked Russian mobilization against Austria. In August, Germany declared war on Russia and France. Germany invaded Belgium, causing Britain to declare war against Germany. From an 1839 agreement with the Belgians, the British had agreed to support Belgian neutrality. The British entered the war for several reasons beyond honoring the Belgian agreement and the Triple Entente. The British also found it unacceptable that German troops might be stationed right across the English Channel. German control of Western Europe represented a serious threat. German imperialism that received the support of secular intellectuals and even liberal theologians such as Adolf von Harnack was a worrisome trend. The war quickly spread beyond the boundaries of Europe for three main reasons. First, colonies became natural extensions among the European nations. For example, Canada and Australia were quick to support Britain. Second, as the war grew, Europeans pushed for additional colonial recruits. Third, some countries entered the war for reasons of national policy that had nothing to do with Franz Ferdinand's assassination or any alliance considerations. Japan, for example, entered the war in 1914 in a successful attempt to gain control of Germany's Pacific possessions. The first phase of combat on the Western Front was when the Germans attempted to defeat the French by surging across Belgium into northern France. Deep into France, the goal was for the German armies to surge southward in an encircling movement. This was the Schieffelin Plan. The miracle of the Marne prevented further advances by the German armies. Although German forces had to retreat from some of their territorial gains in France, they controlled a large portion of northeast France. The French also suffered huge losses. Almost half of French casualties of the whole war occurred in 1914. The second phase of the war in the West lasted from November 1914 to March 1918. At the time, no one expected the full horror of the new style of combat, trench warfare. Barely imaginable was the slaughter of cavalry troops charging machine guns. The sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of lives was often only a temporary conquest of a few miles of land. Casualties were enormous on both sides. Fronts formed immediately where invaders met defenders. The opponents held their ground, each behind dense belts of barbed wire. With their extensive trenches and concrete pillboxes, they refused to give up hard-fought territory. The fortified trenches stretched almost 500 miles from Switzerland to the English Channel. The trenches, deep as men were tall, sheltered soldiers on an open field. Each enemy fortified their positions. From 1914 until 1918, the trench line scarcely moved, even though brave men on both sides hurled themselves repeatedly across no man's land. In total, approximately 25,000 miles of trench scarred the elongated front, dug in parallel network systems between a few yards and even a mile apart. Soldiers ate, slept, and passed time in the trenches. Ordered to attack, the men climbed out of the trenches. The result was often slaughter. Machine guns firing 600 rounds every minute, were concentrated in nests that destroyed the repeated waves of charging infantry. Not only machine guns, but infantry confronted barbed wire, explosive grenades, and poison gas. Both the Germans and the French used chemical weapons in 1914, but the effects of the noxious vapors were rarely serious. The Germans took it to another level. On April 22nd, 1915, the Germans released a large volume of compressed chlorine, probably close to 150 tons of chlorine gas at Ypres. The suffocating gas drifted into the wind into a 4-mile wide sector, killing some soldiers outright, seriously incapacitating many more. The release of poison gas against Allied troops provoked great indignation in the Western world and, quote, was denounced by many Allied leaders as flagrant breach of the rules and customs of war. The third phase of the war in the West lasted about 8 months in 1918, from late March to November 11. Using new artillery and infantry tactics, the Germans attempted to defeat the Allies. I'll say a little bit more about this later. One of the factors that made World War I so different than its predecessors was the enormous scope of the conflict. This applied not only to the size of the armies themselves, but the demands that the warfare placed on almost every aspect of society. For the first time, it was acceptable to use terms such as total war and the home front. When the military conflict escalated throughout Europe, there was an increasing demand for military supplies. At home, factories were in full operation to meet these demands. Textile production was needed for uniforms, blankets, and bandages, and metal production was needed for machines, tools, weapons, and ammunition. Governments increased dramatically in size and influence. With the war dragging on, volunteer soldiers were replaced by conscripted draftees. Women, at least temporarily, enjoyed greater economic advantages in the process of supporting a total war. To keep war production high, there was the employment of millions of women on the domestic front. Many women had never been employed as wage earners. They became truck drivers, ambulance drivers, assembly line laborers, and fulfilled other positions that normally went to men. Often the women represented the middle class rather than women of lower socioeconomic status. The war caused political turmoil, especially in Russia. Militarily, the Eastern Front fighting took place over a vast distance. Artillery was less dense, and there was ample room for cavalry to maneuver. Despite these facts, there were heavier casualties on the Eastern Front than the Western Front. The Germans wanted to quickly defeat the Russians and then concentrate their forces on the Western Front. The Russian armies suffered devastating defeats, but they survived the German assaults. However, there were grave consequences. The Germans were in control of the rich and populous region in the Russian Poland region. Russian society was also hit with inflation and food shortages. On the domestic front, military collapse and bread riots led Tsar Nicholas II to step down in early 1917. Nicholas was a pious and well-intentioned man, but dull-wittingly autocratic. His major error was appointing himself as commander-in-chief. When the Russian people witnessed his mismanagement of the war, it became clear that his dynasty was doomed. The February Revolution, again, 1917, put in place a provisional government that was dedicated to reform, but also as poorly prepared as the Tsar to fight the war. The provincial government's decision to stay in the war doomed it from the start. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, adopted the position at the beginning of the war that the conflict should not be one between nations, but rather between classes. This is your standard Marxism. So in 1917, Lenin took advantage of the Russian situation better than Nicholas or the leaders of the provisional government. Lenin believed that the industrial workers desperately needed the leadership of an organized party to reach revolutionary consciousness. He theorized, consequently, that a revolution could be made. The motto, Peace, land, and bread summed up the Russian situation as well as Lenin's pragmatic political gifts. In an almost bloodless coup, he seized control of the government in the October Revolution. An indication of what was to unfold was the communist confiscation of church property. The Russian Orthodox Church was at the mercy of these atheistic Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks' hatred of Christianity meant that there were other Christian groups that the socialists treated terribly. The prosperity of the Mennonite communities in the Volga region, for example, was easy pickings for the Bolsheviks. Not fighting back, the Mennonite men were murdered, their women raped, and anything of value was stolen. The communists exited the war, but the Germans imposed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on Russia, a treaty that proved to be as harsh as the Treaty of Versailles 2 years later. As for the socialist policy of the Bolsheviks, the signs were even gloomier. However, Russian idealists of the Bolshevik Revolution were joyful. Their vision was to triumph, showing no tolerance for contrary opinions. Russian novelist Boris Pilnyak wrote, quote, "Our revolution is a rebellion in the name of the conscious, rational, purposeful, and dynamic principle of life against the elemental, senseless, biological atomism of life. That is, against the peasant roots of our Russian history, against its aimlessness, its on-technological character, against the holy and idiotic philosophy of Tolstoy's Karativ in War and Peace." A side note on Pilnak is that the socialists put a bullet in his head in the 1930s. By 1917, the main combatants were exhausted and almost bankrupt. The German government insisted that German churches sacrifice treasured items for the war effort. For example, German parishioners saw the removal of church bills across the nation. It was a rough year. The Russians were out of the war, but they were led by bloodthirsty thugs. The Italians were unsuccessful in defeating the Austrians, and the British had tough battles in the Middle East with the Turks, and of course the ongoing conflict on the Western Front. While the Ottoman Empire disintegrated, the Turks carried out genocide on more than 1 million Armenian Christians. And this took place between 1915 and 1916. So things were really quite a mess in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East in 1917. As for the United States and Canada, American citizens died at sea on ships hit with German submarines. They had yet to enter the war, but there were American citizens who were killed. And Canadians experienced religious and political division over the federal government's call for conscription. With no great love for Britain, French Canadian Catholics were far less enthusiastic about being forced to fight in the war compared to English-speaking mainline Protestants. The attempt by religious leaders, including Pope Benedict XV, to see a negotiated peace went nowhere. The entrance of the United States, an untested but heavily populated industrial giant, changed the course of World War I. In a last desperate offensive in March 1918, the Germans advanced westward with more than 1 million men, intending to finish what they had started in the fall of 1914. The German offensive broke the trench deadlock, but they did not find the victory that they desired. The British scored a major victory at the Battle of Amiens in early April. By the middle of the summer, the German forces were on the run. Many of them actually were captured and were prisoners of war. The stronger allies forced the Germans back to Belgium, the Rhine, and beyond. However, it is important to note that there was no fighting on German soil. Also, the defeat of German forces only became a sure thing near the end of the war. Consequently, most of the German people did not know of the clear German defeat. On November 11, 1918, the war ended, and there was celebration by the victors. But the German people did not view November 11 as a day of surrender. The Germans viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a disaster for them. The treaty forced Germany to accept full responsibility for all losses and damages suffered by the Allies. Germany was to pay reparation of approximately 33 billion over a period of years. Germany's army was to be reduced to 100,000 volunteers, and gone was the German Air Force and the German submarines. The treaty stipulated that the French were to control the Rhineland for 15 years. So this is just west of the Rhine River and about 50 kilometers east of the Rhine, so that territory along the Rhine to the east. France also received Alsace-Lorraine and gained access to the coal mines of the Saar region for 15 years. Germany also lost some of its territory to France, Denmark, Belgium, and Poland, and it lost its African and Asian colonies. One interpretation is that the treaty provisions resulted in an ominous sense of national humiliation and deep resentment. Many Germans felt dishonored and plundered by the victor nations of World War I. Some scholars argue that the treaty guaranteed renewed conflict someday in the future. British economist John Maynard Keynes, who had been at Paris to witness some of the treaty talks, wrote the book Economic Consequences of the Peace. Very popular in Germany and with intellectuals elsewhere, the book argued that the treaty was terribly flawed. It completed the economic destruction done to Europe by the war. The reparations crippled Germany. In her award-winning book, Paris 1919, historian Margaret Macmillan challenges this interpretation. She argues that the Germans ignored the fact that fighting the Great War had been expensive and that losing it had meant they could not transfer the cost to anyone else. The final reparations number set, as I mentioned earlier, was 33 billion, but in reality, Germany was committed to pay less than 16.5 billion. And in the end, Germany only paid 4.5 billion. This figure was less than what France paid Germany after the Franco-Prussian War. Macmillan claims that when historians examine the historical details carefully, the picture of a Germany crushed by a vindictive peace cannot be sustained. Germany lost the war, but still was the largest country in Europe west of Russia. With the reemergence of Poland, Germany had a better strategic position than before 1914. In place of Austria-Hungary, Germany now had weaker and quarreling states on its eastern frontier. If the treaty was such a disaster, how did Germany extend its economic and political position in Europe in less than 2 decades? Macmillan further argues that the treaty is not to blame for the rise of Hitler domination. In the end, the treaty was, quote, never consistently enforced or only enough to irritate German nationalism without limiting German power to disrupt the peace of Europe, end quote. The start of World War II was due to 20 years of decisions taken or not taken, not of arrangements made in 1919. Historian Paul Johnson takes a similar position to Macmillan's. He is especially critical of Keynes' book, The Economic Consequence of the Peace, calling it one of the most destructive books of the 20th century. Johnson writes that it contributed to the future war Keynes himself was anxious to avert. In Johnson's assessment, Keynes was not interested in military security, frontiers, and population shifts whose intrinsic and emotional importance he tragically underestimated. The effects of the war were profound. In the years leading up to the global conflict, secularization of Western societies, aided by the rise of rationalism, Darwinism, and socialism, was a sad and dehumanizing development. There was a widening gap in Christianity between modernists and traditionalists. The modernists proclaimed there was a better world. This was something they believed was at hand. They spoke of the kingdom of God on earth. The Great War weakened the optimistic position of never-ending progress, where humans with the proper humanist education and thinking could control the destiny of their nation. In Germany, fewer people had accepted biblical Christianity. Rationalistic philosophy and liberal theology became the norm in the universities and most of the churches. Evangelical scholar Francis Schaeffer argued that after World War I, there was political and economic chaos and a flood of moral permissiveness in Germany. There was anger over the state of the economy and politics, confusion over the meaning of life, and a lack of spiritual sustenance for struggling souls. With many European intellectuals seeking to find some sense of the era, there was a looming possibility of terrible things ahead. World War I marked the point in which the West ceased to be in the ascendant over the other civilizations of the world. Its political influence had peaked and its cultural confidence shattered. It seemed to be a botched civilization. Except for the United States, which experienced a booming economic times in the 1920s, the nations directly involved in the war faced economic challenges. Some scholars argue that the war constituted the defining event of the 20th century. Certainly, the war resulted in revolution in Russia and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It also played a role in the rise of two types of socialism: the National Socialists in Germany and an Italian brand of socialism identified as fascism. Thank you.